Hello, fellow bibliophiles, and welcome back to Blatantly Bookish. I'm Marissa, and today I want to chat about my 5 favorite nonfiction books about the Victorian era. As Victober sadly comes to a close and Nonfiction November gets started, I thought it might be the perfect time to make this video. If you're like me and have a lot of trouble saying goodbye to Victober, it's sometimes fun to shift your focus to some nonfiction about the era. Or you could just keep the Victober momentum going and keep reading some Victorian novels like I might do this year. I kind of wish there was an extra month between October and November right now. But anyway, in case you aren't familiar with Nonfiction November, I will link Olive from A Book Olive's official announcement and recommendations videos below. If you're looking for a way to make nonfiction about the Victorian era fit into Olive's prompts for the year, most of these books are a record of the time period. I'm sure you could consider them either in or out of your element, and books about Victorian true crime could also be said to uncover the secrets of all of those involved. So without further ado, let's chat about some of my favorite nonfiction books about my favorite time period. The first book I want to talk about is How to Be a Victorian by Ruth Goodman. How to Be a Victorian goes through a day in the life of a Victorian person from dawn to dusk and includes everything he or she might have done. It talks about the kinds of things that we wouldn't necessarily pick up from reading Victorian novels. There are just certain details of everyday life that authors expect a reader to simply be familiar with if they were alive during the time period the book was written. Ruth Goodman is an expert historian and even lived like a Victorian for periods of time during her life. So I found her personal anecdotes really added to this subject matter. She's done Victorian chores, cooked and eaten Victorian recipes, made and worn all layers of her own Victorian clothing, and tried out cosmetic and medicinal recipes from the era. This book touches on pretty much everything from life without indoor heating to the Victorian understanding of germ theory, details about Victorian cosmetics, the infant opioid epidemic of the era, how clothing varies drastically by time period within the era and by class as well, and so much more. Ruth does a wonderful job of explaining the differences in life throughout the Victorian era, acknowledging that life in the early Victorian period was quite different from, say, the 1880s, as well as explaining the differences in everyday life based on class and urban versus rural life as well. Ruth Goodman has an uncanny way of making history come to life and making the past feel very personal. This is such a phenomenal book that isn't just facts about the Victorians, but demonstrates such a reverence and respect and genuine excitement for history itself. These books that I'm mentioning today aren't ranked in any way, but I would have to say that this book is the #1 resource that I would recommend for anyone interested in a comprehensive take on the Victorian era, as seen through daily life in the time period. You also might be familiar with Ruth from the TV show Victorian Farm, which was on BBC, where she worked together with archaeologists to recreate life in a Shropshire farm in the 1880s. It's a wonderful show where you can see aspects of a select slice of Victorian life for yourself. And it's a really great companion to this book as well, I think. The next book I want to talk about is Elegant Etiquette in the 19th Century by Mallory James. I usually recommend this book during Jane Austen July, but it does actually span the entirety of the 19th century, most of which, of course, is the Victorian era. This book focuses on the upper classes of the time period and lays out the social code they would have been expected to follow in society, basically what it meant to be polite during the era. It draws on advice given in etiquette manuals over the course of the time period and goes into all the nitty-gritty details about Victorian etiquette, including a whole breakdown of the class and rank system in Victorian society, dinner party etiquette, ballroom etiquette, guidelines on conversations and correspondence, the concept of calling cards and how to use them, and so much more. This may not be the best place to begin with nonfiction about the time period because it is very, very detailed and can be dense at times, though I think the level of detail in this book is fascinating, and it's a great resource to better understand manners and propriety in Victorian literature. It can give you better insight into understanding when someone is acting inappropriately or rudely, or when something is awkward or defies convention in a Victorian novel. This is just such a fantastic and thorough guide to manners in the time period, and I highly recommend it if you are an avid reader of Victorian literature. Next, I'm moving on from books about everyday life to a bit of Victorian true crime. The third book I want to talk about is The Five: The Untold Lives of the Women Killed by Jack the Ripper by Hallie Rubenhold. This is a fantastic piece of nonfiction all about the lives of Jack the Ripper's 5 most famous victims. Rather than focusing on their horrible deaths, though, it looks at their lives and uses their stories as a lens to examine some less talked about topics in Victorian society. The author challenges the idea that these women were prostitutes or worked in the sex trade at all. Instead, she focuses on their struggles with mental illness, addiction, and poverty. She looks at syphilis, workhouses, infant mortality, and the female alcoholic. This book does a wonderful job of portraying the intense ease of fluctuation in socioeconomic status at the time. Many of these women were born to respectable households, but some tragedy or major event in their lives led them to destitution and left them vulnerable to Jack the Ripper. I've read a considerable amount of nonfiction about the Victorian era at this point, but this book discusses themes that aren't usually addressed, or if mentioned, take up a chapter or two, but not the entirety of the book. This book is such a captivating and interesting exploration of gender and poverty in the Victorian era, and well worth the read if you're interested in that subject matter at all. Another phenomenal Victorian true crime book is The Suspicions of Mr. Witcher, A Shocking Murder and the Undoing of a Great Victorian Detective by Kate Summerscale. If you want to know more about the real-life person who inspired the character of Detective Cuff in The Moonstone, as well as many other fictional detectives, including Inspector Bucket from Bleak House, look no further. This book is about Jack Witcher, who was one of the original 8 detectives of Scotland Yard and who inspired many early detective figures in Victorian literature. The book focuses on a case he was involved in, the famous Victorian Road Hill House murder case, where in 1860, 3-year-old Francis Saville Kent went missing from his crib and was found at the bottom of a privy with his throat cut almost to the point of decapitation. It was a horrific and brutal crime, which led to a national obsession with detection. Witcher believed something that the English public had issues grappling with, namely that someone within the family was responsible for the murder of young Saville Kent. The idea that someone within the calm domestic sphere was able to commit and carry out such a horrific crime shocked the Victorians and threatened their values of family and sense of security within the domestic sphere. Eventually, without sufficient evidence or a confession, Witcher's case was circumstantial, and the situation ended up destroying his reputation and his career. Though, in the end, of course, he was proved to be right. This book was so thorough and well-researched, it was really a joy to read. It not only followed the Road Hill House murder case and Jack Witcher's career, but also the history of police detectives and how their real-life cases inspired the emergence of detective fiction as a genre. I can see this book being too detailed for some, but it is an absolute must-read for anyone who loves the Victorian era or who is interested in detective fiction or true crime. And last but not least, I can't finish this video without mentioning my favorite nonfiction author, or without including a biography of the defining lady of the era, Queen Victoria. The last book on this list is Queen Victoria, Daughter, Wife, Mother, Widow by Lucy Worsley. Lucy Worsley just writes the most fantastic nonfiction. It's well-researched and historically accurate, detailed, and engaging. You can always feel her passion for the subject matter behind her writing. Her Queen Victoria biography focuses on 24 days that are emblematic of Queen Victoria's life, covering the period from her birth to her death. About half the book is devoted to her early life and marriage to Prince Albert, and the other half delves into into her widowhood and later reign. As someone who loves Victorian literature, learning about the monarch who the time period is named for has always interested me. It's fascinating to see how a female monarch was situated in such a high seat of political power and thrived in a society where women didn't have the right to vote. She was simultaneously held to the societal standards of a woman, daughter, mother, wife, widow, and yet she ruled the British Empire. Like the Victorian era itself, a peculiar mix of great progress and stringent social restriction, Queen Victoria's life was full of inherent contradictions. If you've read other Queen Victoria biographies before, this might not have any shocking new news about her life, but what I love so much about this book is how it doesn't try to push any one image of Victoria on the reader. Some biographies try to paint her as the perfect mother and focus on her relationship with her children. Some focus on her period of mourning, which does play a rather large role in her life. Some focus more on her relationship between her and Prince Albert. Some focus more on her role in growing the British Empire. But this book was so wonderful in that it acknowledged all of the common perceptions and portrayals of Victoria's life. But for the most part, it allowed the reader to form our own judgments of her and allowed all of these different takes on her life to exist simultaneously. So those are my top 5 nonfiction books about the Victorian era, but they are by no means the only great works of nonfiction about the time period out there. I would love to hear in the comment section down below if you've read these books and what you've thought of them, if there are any of them that you're really looking forward to reading, and even more importantly, what are your favorite nonfiction books about the Victorian era that may not have been included on this list? I would love some good nonfiction recommendations about the Victorian era down below. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you all had an absolutely fantastic Victober. And until next time, I look forward to seeing you in another bookish video very soon. Bye!